The alarm on Threnody Station screamed before I even understood what I was looking at. A gap in the containment wall, only a few centimeters wide, and something small and gray was already halfway through it. My hearts, all three of them, seized at once. I was standing in the observation gallery, close enough to the glass that my breath fogged it, and I remember thinking, this is the moment everything changes. My name is Vorin Is, and I served as third envoy for the Kryzai Dominion. I had traveled across 4 star systems to attend the Summit of Sovereign Species, an event held once every cycle on this neutral station, where every founding world brings its most fearsome living creature for the rest of the galaxy to see. It is not science. It is a warning wrapped in ceremony. Every species says, without saying it, this is what our planet made, and you should be careful. I had seen the Threll matriarch crack open a metal door with nothing but her jaw. I had seen the Korvathi Skyfang drip venom that could dissolve bone in seconds. I believed, standing in that gallery, that I finally understood what fear was supposed to look like. Then the gap opened, and the small gray animal from the human exhibit slipped through it like water finding a crack in stone. On the other side of that gap waited the Osrai predator, a creature with too many eyes and a body built entirely around swallowing things whole. It had barely moved all day. It did not need to move. Everything about it said, "Come closer if you dare," and nothing ever did. The little gray animal did not hesitate. It did not even slow down. I gripped the railing in front of me so hard I heard the metal creak under my claws. Around me, delegates from a dozen worlds leaned forward at the same time, and for one long second, nobody in that gallery breathed. The human delegation stood a few meters to my left. Their envoy, a woman named Laura Finch, kept both hands folded in front of her, and her face showed nothing. Not fear, not excitement, nothing at all. I had never seen a species so calm while looking directly at chaos. The creature they had brought was called a honey badger. When it first walked out into its exhibit that morning, half the room had laughed. It was small, no taller than a child, with a coat of rough gray and black fur, and a walk that looked clumsy, almost lazy. Next to the towering monsters from other worlds, it looked like a mistake. I had laughed too, quietly, behind my hand. I am not proud of that now. Laura Finch had stood at the podium earlier that day and said something I did not fully understand until much later. She said, "We did not bring you the biggest animal on our planet. We brought you the one that never checks how big the other side is before deciding to fight." At the time, I thought it was a strange thing to say. I thought maybe it was a joke, the same way the animal itself seemed like a joke. I was wrong about that too. Inside the exhibit, the Osrai creature turned its many eyes toward the badger, and let out a sound low enough that I felt it in the floor beneath my feet. It was a warning. Every predator in that hall understood it. Stay back. The badger walked straight into it anyway. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. The badger did not slow, did not circle, did not test the air the way every other creature on that station had done before making a move. It simply closed the distance and struck first, fast and low, going for the only part of the enormous creature it could actually reach. The Osrai predator reacted the way anything that size would react to being challenged by something a fraction of its own weight. It lunged, jaws wide enough to take the badger whole, and for one terrible heartbeat I was certain I was about to watch something die in front of an audience of a dozen species. The badger vanished inside that enormous mouth. Someone in the gallery screamed. I think it might have been me. Then something happened that I still find difficult to describe, even now, even after telling this story more times than I can count. The badger did not fight to get away. It did not try to escape the grip at all. Instead, inside that impossible hold, its whole body twisted, loose and strange, like its skin did not fit the same way ours does. And somehow, impossibly, it turned itself completely around, while still trapped inside that grip. I did not understand what I was seeing until the Osrai predator suddenly reared back, its whole enormous body flinching away, retreating across its own enclosure as fast as its size would allow. It pressed itself against the far wall of the exhibit, all of its many eyes wide and fixed on the small gray shape still standing in the middle of the floor. The badger stood there a moment longer, breathing hard, covered in marks it clearly would not soon forget, and I expected it to run, to hide, to do something that made sense for a creature that size. Instead, it turned around, walked back toward the gap in the wall at an unhurried pace, and disappeared through it as if none of what had just happened mattered at all. The gallery around me had gone completely silent. Every delegate from every species stared at that gap in the wall, waiting for something else to happen, and nothing did. Containment teams arrived within minutes, sealing the breach properly this time, running scans, shouting instructions to each other in half a dozen languages at once. I barely noticed any of it. I was still staring at the space where the badger had been, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Laura Finch had not moved from where she stood. She had not run to the glass. She had not called out instructions to anyone. She simply watched the whole thing happen with the same calm expression she had worn since the beginning of the summit, and when it was over, she turned to the delegate standing beside her and asked, quietly, whether the water dish in the badger's enclosure had been refilled. I found that detail more unsettling than anything else that happened that day. The formal inquiry began less than an hour later. The Osrai delegation demanded an explanation, their voices sharp with outrage, insisting that such an act of aggression could not go unanswered. I understood their anger. Their prized predator, the creature they had brought specifically to demonstrate the power of their world, had just been forced into retreat by something a fraction of its size, in front of every species that mattered. Laura Finch stood before the review board that evening, and I attended, along with every other envoy who had witnessed the incident firsthand. The room was tense in a way I had rarely felt during my years of service. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The lead reviewer, an elder from a species I did not recognize, asked her directly whether humanity intended to apologize for what had happened. "We apologize for the containment failure," she said. "That was a mistake on our side, and we take responsibility for it. We do not apologize for what the badger did once the gap appeared. That is not something we can control, and honestly, we would not want to." The reviewer asked her to explain herself further, and I remember leaning forward slightly, wanting to understand. "Every other delegation here brought us their strongest animal," she said. "The one built to win. The one shaped by its whole world to survive by being bigger, faster, more dangerous than anything around it. We didn't do that. We brought you the one animal on our planet that has never once checked whether it could win a fight before deciding to have one anyway." Someone from another delegation asked whether this reckless behavior was meant to represent humanity as a whole, and I watched Laura Finch consider the question carefully before answering. "It's not reckless," she said. "It's just honest. Every other predator up there today made a calculation before it acted. Ours doesn't calculate, it just decides, and it doesn't change its mind halfway through. If you want to understand what kind of planet we come from, that's your answer. Not the biggest thing on it, the thing that never stops to ask if it's allowed to win." I sat with that answer for a long time after the hearing ended. I thought about all the worlds I had visited before joining this Dominion post, all the species I had studied, all the predators I had cataloged in briefing documents meant to help us understand who we were dealing with. None of those documents had prepared me for a creature that simply refused to be afraid, and none of them had prepared me for a species that seemed to admire that quality above every other trait a predator could possess. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the observation gallery more than once, drawn back to the empty space where the badger's enclosure sat. Quiet now, its damage repaired, its gap sealed for good. I watched other delegates walk past it quickly, glancing at it the way you glance at something you would rather not think too hard about. I did not walk past it quickly. I stood there and studied it, trying to understand what it was about, that small, strange creature that had unsettled an entire summit of powerful species so completely. On the third day after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to approach Laura Finch directly. She was standing near the human delegation's quarters, reviewing something on a small handheld device, and she looked up when I addressed her by name. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment the gap appeared in that containment wall. I asked her whether she had known, truly known, that this could happen when she agreed to bring that animal to the summit. She set the device down and looked at me for a long moment before answering. "We knew there was a risk," she said. "Every containment system fails eventually. We've seen it happen on our own planet more times than I'd like to admit. But that's not really the point. The point isn't whether the badger might get loose. The point is what happens if it does." I asked her what she meant by that, and she explained it to me the way you might explain something to a child, gently, without any hint of condescension. "Every other species here built their whole presentation around control," she said. "Big cages, thick glass, careful handling. Because the animals they brought are dangerous specifically because they're huge and strong and built to overpower anything smaller. Ours is dangerous for a completely different reason. It doesn't need size. It doesn't need strength. It just needs to decide that it's going to win. And then it acts like that decision is already final. You can put it in the smallest cage in the building, and it will still walk out of that cage believing it's in charge of the room." I asked her if she was afraid of it, and she smiled slightly, the first real expression I had seen on her face since the summit began. "No," she said, "I respect it. There's a difference." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, long after I had returned to my own quarters, and long after the summit itself had ended. and the delegates had scattered back to their home systems. I thought about the Threll matriarch, built by evolution to survive an unforgiving world through sheer size and strength. I thought about the Korvathi Skyfang, perfected over countless generations to kill quickly and efficiently with venom that left nothing to chance. I thought about every predator I had ever studied, all of them shaped by necessity into something that made sense, something predictable, something you could plan around if you understood the rules of their world. The honey badger did not follow any of those rules. It did not care about size. It did not calculate odds before committing to a fight. It simply moved forward, again and again, refusing to accept that anything might be too big or too dangerous to challenge. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that this was not an accident of humanity's choosing. It was a message, delivered quietly and without any need for explanation. Other species had spent their entire presentations trying to prove how strong their worlds were. Humanity had done something different. They had shown the galaxy something far more unsettling than strength. They had shown a complete lack of hesitation, a creature that did not need to be the strongest thing in the room to walk through it like it owned every corner. Word of the incident spread quickly after the summit ended, traveling faster through diplomatic channels than any official report could keep pace with. I heard whispers of it in meetings months later, envoys from distant systems asking quietly whether the stories were true, whether a creature smaller than most children had really forced one of the galaxy's most feared predators into retreat. Each time I was asked, I told the story exactly as I had witnessed it, without exaggeration, because the truth needed no exaggeration to be unsettling. I told them about the gap in the wall. I told them about the badger crossing that gap without hesitation. I told them about the Osrai predator retreating to the far wall of its own enclosure, refusing to approach the space where the badger had disappeared, even hours later, even when offered food. I told them what Laura Finch had said during the hearing, about calculation and decision, about creatures that stop to think before they act, and the one creature that simply never stops at all. Every time I finished telling the story, I noticed the same reaction settle over whoever was listening, a quiet unease, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that makes you glance differently at any human envoy you happen to meet afterward. I attended 2 more summits after that one, each time watching new delegations bring their most powerful predators forward, each time watching the human delegation bring something small and unassuming that made the rest of the room laugh, at first, before the day was over. I never witnessed another containment breach quite like the first one. Perhaps the station improved its systems after that incident. Perhaps humanity simply never needed to prove the point twice. Either way, the story remained, passed quietly from envoy to envoy, growing slightly with each retelling, though I always tried to keep mine as close to the truth as memory allowed. There is a phrase that began circulating among the diplomatic corps not long after that summit, one I have heard repeated in more languages than I can count. Do not measure whether the human can win. Watch instead what happens when it simply decides not to lose. I think about that phrase often, especially now, years later, long after I left my post as third envoy and returned to my homeworld to serve in a quieter role. I think about the Threll matriarch and the Korvathi Skyfang, and all the other magnificent, terrifying creatures I catalogued during my years of service, each one built by its world to be the strongest thing that world could produce. And then I think about a small gray animal, no taller than a child, walking through a gap in a containment wall without a single moment of hesitation, facing something many times its size, and simply refusing to accept that it might lose. I think about Laura Finch, standing calmly at that podium, explaining without any trace of pride or exaggeration that her people had not brought their biggest creature, nor their fastest, nor the one with the sharpest claws or the deadliest venom. They had brought the one animal that never once checked the odds before deciding to fight anyway. I understand now what she meant, though it took me far longer than I would like to admit. Every species that attended that summit tried to show the galaxy their strength. Humanity showed something else entirely. Something that unsettled every delegate in that gallery far more deeply than size or speed or venom ever could. They showed a complete absence of doubt, a creature, and perhaps a species, built entirely around the idea that giving up was never an option worth considering, no matter what stood on the other side of that gap in the wall. I have traveled to a great many worlds since that summit, met a great many species, catalogued a great many predators for briefing documents meant to help others understand exactly what they were dealing with. None of them ever unsettled me the way that small gray animal did, walking calmly back through a gap in a wall as though nothing at all had happened, leaving behind a much larger, much more powerful creature that would never approach that spot again. That is the story I carry with me now, the one I tell whenever someone asks me what it truly means to encounter humanity for the first time. It is not a story about size or speed or strength. It is a story about a species that chose, quite deliberately, to introduce itself to the galaxy through the one creature on their entire planet that never once stopped to ask whether it was allowed to win.